All right, I would like to welcome everybody today on Saturday, February 20th, to one of our many Black History and Culture Month events. Today, we are welcoming Dr. Lee Ryan, and her topic today will be on enslaved life and labor on Maryland plantations. I have the privilege, my name is Rebecca Sutphin, and I work for the City of Greenbelt, and I have the privilege today of being your Zoom monitor. A few Zoom etiquette policies. We do ask that you keep your video on turned off, as well as your microphone on mute. Throughout the presentation, if you do have questions, feel free to use the chat feature. The chat feature will permit you to send questions to me directly. And at the end of our event, Dr. Ryan will have time to answer any questions and answers, as well as any other thoughts and comments on today's presentation. At this time, I would like to introduce Dr. Lois Rosado. She is the co-chair of our Black History and Culture Committee, and she will take the time to introduce Dr. Ryan. Dr. Rosado?
Thank you, Rebecca. And welcome everyone, as Rebecca has stated. Dr. Lee Ryan volunteers at Riversdale's House Museum, where she is now working with their staff to develop an exhibit devoted to enslaved workers there. She also volunteers with the Prince George's County Historical Library and the Prince George's County Lynching Memorial Project, where she and I met. At Riversdale, Lee researches the enslaved Adam Francis Plummer's family. Adam's son, Henry Vinton Plummer, was the first African-American chaplain in the U.S. Regular Army, and she helped with the successful appeal to change his 1894 dishonorable discharge to honorable. In 2018, she successfully nominated Emily Saunders Plummer, Adam's wife, to the Maryland Women's Hall of Fame. Dr. Ryan retired after directing the University of Maryland's Writing Center for 30 plus years. At UMD, she also taught courses on plantation life and local antebellum history. Dr. Ryan brought a wealth of information and resources to the Greenbelt Black History Month, Black History and Culture Committee for our celebrating this month. And we are honored that she is here today and talk about life, what life was like for the enslaved workers on plantations in Maryland. Please welcome Dr. Lee Ryan.
Thank you so much, Becky and Lois, and actually to all the Greenbelt groups and residents who helped make this wonderful collection of programs for Black History Month possible. My title comes from a poem by Lucille Clifton, a former poet laureate of Maryland. She visited Walnut Grove Plantation in South Carolina in 1989 and was not pleased with her visit. While there was evidence everywhere of work that had been done on the plantation, as she put it, and I quote, "Nobody mentioned slaves." That was underscored by the two cemeteries there. The first one on the left belonged to the white family that owned Walnut Grove. It came complete with headstones giving names, dates, some appropriate phrases or verses. But the one on the right was the slave cemetery, and it simply marked graves with white rocks. As Lucille Clifton explains in her poem, among the rocks at Walnut Grove, some of these honored dead were dark, some of these dark were slaves, some of these slaves were women. Some of them did this honored work. Tell me your names, foremothers, brothers. That's just part of her poem. But what I want to do today is tell you a little bit about what some of these people did and to bring you to mention some of their names. All right, slaves were brought to our shores in 1619. And we were originally a society with slaves. That first ship had about 20 people on it. It landed at Point Comfort, Virginia, which is now known as Fort Monroe. And these people ended up in Jamestown. Most of them were domestic workers, or they worked as artisans in trades, but slavery was not central to the economy or the social structures then. That changed. And it changed when tobacco became an important cash crop in the Chesapeake region. Tobacco happens to be a very intensive crop. In late winter or early spring, they start seedlings, and then in May, those get planted, followed by a lot of weeding, hoeing, inspecting for worms and insects. When flowers grow, they have to be removed so that the leaves will grow stronger. In August and September, from August to September, they usually grow 4 to 7 feet. And then in the fall, of course, they have to be harvested, which means cutting the entire plant and hanging it out to dry. With that crop and its dependency on large numbers of people to grow, we became a slave society. What's kind of interesting, and I just want to add this little piece here, we tend to think of our country, of North America, as having had many slaves here, and to a degree we did, but what I find really interesting is that really only a very small percentage of Africans were brought to North America. There were 12.5 million people shipped from Africa, and only 10.7 million survived the trip, but most went to places like Brazil or Cuba or the Caribbean, and actually only 388,000 were shipped to North America. All right. Many plantations were on Maryland's eastern shore, and some others are on the western shore, which is this side of the Chesapeake. I tried to pick out some that were just sort of close to Greenbelt, just to give you a little bit of a sample of what's here. The first one in the upper left-hand corner is Bel Air. It's in Bowie, Maryland, and it was built in 1745 by the provincial governor, Samuel Ogle. Originally, he had about 500 acres, but that amount of land grew as they bought more land or inherited some. It's certainly known for growing tobacco and corn, but was exceptional in terms of breeding racehorses, which it did for over 3 centuries. Below that is Montpelier Mansion, built in Laurel in 1780 for the Snowden family. It too is known for agriculture, but also for ironworks. Marietta, in the upper right-hand corner, was built in 1812 and 13 for Gabriel Duval. You may recognize that name because he was a very prominent politician and jurist, and he was an associate judge on the Supreme Court. Below that is Riversdale, which was built between 1801 and 1807. It's on about 739 acres, or at least it was originally. Construction was started by Henri Stier. He had come from Belgium with his family in 1794, escaping from the French Revolution. He and his family lived in Philadelphia, then in Annapolis, and eventually decided to stay here and began building Riversdale. Shortly after he started, Napoleon declared amnesty for people who had fled Belgium, and he and his family decided they would return, all but their youngest daughter. Rosalie had met and married George Calvert, and they at this point had 2 children, so they moved into the house and finished construction on it. were very fortunate because the family then wrote letters for 20 years. And we have a book called Mistress of Riversdale, which covered those 20 years and tells us a lot, not only about the daily operating of the plantation, but the social picture of the day, the political picture, and so on. Greenbelt really has no existing plantation homes, but it certainly has vestiges of some. In 1935, when this land was purchased for the planned green town, there were 3 cemeteries: the Walker, the Turner, and the Hamilton cemeteries. The Turner Cemetery was the most accessible, so it became the Greenbelt Cemetery. Now, the Walkers settled between Kenilworth and Greenbelt Road and the Beltway. There's a marker, and that's what's on the right side of your screen, in front of the TGI Fridays, actually, on University Boulevard. Here, Isaac, Charles, and Nathan Walker erected a large white log house in 1750, and they named it Toping Castle to honor their ancestral home in Scotland. Here we have a picture of a page out of Sarah Turner's Bible where she listed enslaved people. Chadwick Turner had purchased 125 acres in 1759, and he called it Wildcat. They later acquired additional land, but he and his wife, Sarah, raised 9 children in this original home. By the way, I want to add one more thing too. The Turner family originally came and settled on Maryland's eastern shore, and you can read more about them online in The Turner Family in Hebron by Dr. Henry Chandley Foreman. It's kind of interesting because you begin to see some of what was going on over near where we now see Ocean City, Salisbury. The Hamilton Cemetery, John Hamilton had purchased 240 acres in 1768 and named it Hamilton's Purchase. That's now in Greenbelt off Ridge Road, and it's where the community gardens are. Now, on any plantation, there was a real gendered division of labor. The plantation master was responsible for everything beyond the big house, but the plantation mistress was the one responsible for running the household, and they really tended to keep those very, very separate. Often the plantation mistress was very young. I remember reading a journal of one, Sarah Hainsworth Gale. She actually married John Gale, who was a lawyer and later became the governor of Alabama. He was 12 years older than she was, but he began courting her when she was 15, married her when she was 16, and she had her first child when she was 17. So if you can imagine this young woman coming in to take over a plantation household at 16 and immediately having a child too, it was no small feat. Rosalie, in fact, Calvert was 21 when she married George. He was 10 years older. They had 9 children, and I once sat and figured out, taking all the dates of the 9 children they had, the longest period Rosalie had between having children was 2.5 years. So most of the time, in addition to running the home, she was either pregnant or busy looking after infants and toddlers. The plantation mistress functioned in a way like a CEO on the plantation, but she really had no training and had to just go by whatever she had seen her mother do. I've often wondered about Rosalie doing that because, I mean, her mother didn't even really speak English well, and I'm sure had difficulties operating within her own household. The plantation mistress tended to see slavery in terms of how it benefited her. She had an unquestioned belief in white superiority for the most part, didn't doubt the morality of this institution that made her life possible, and was dependent upon slave labor, but still found their work and their ethics questionable. It's very suspect at times. Okay. Having trouble getting to the next slide.
No, you're not.
Sorry about that. Becky, are you there?
Yeah, did you try hitting the arrows over on your screen? Like on your computer? It won't let you do that?
Nope.
Uh-oh. You might have to back out of your screen, your presentation to get back to it.
Okay.
Sorry about that, technical difficulties.
Okay. Okay, so that should I go completely out?
No.
Yeah, try to go out of it and out of your presentation and come back in. Because you got to share your screen again. There you go.
Thank you everyone for your patience. Okay, this is a picture of Rosalie, Stier, Calvert. Let me get situated here. Okay. Well, it's stopped again here.
You may have to just keep going with it, and we can always, provide the presentation afterwards. But if you can keep talking, I know it's not ideal, but I'm not sure why it's not letting you advance your slides.
Maybe if she hits each slide separately.
Yeah, I'm going to try that.
Thank you, everybody, for your patience.
All right, I'm going to, can you see it now?
Nope, you got to share your screen.
Well, it would help to be able to get it to where I can.
We have somebody telling us that the same thing happened to them in Zoom earlier today. So it may be just Zoom isn't allowing us to do it. But once you try exiting out of what you're in and share your screen again. If you can't get it, you may just need to talk about each slide. And like I said, we can get it to everybody afterwards.
All right, I can't even get back to you now to be able to share my screen. Can I go completely and come back in?
Yep, try that.
Okay.
All right, well, while we're waiting for her to come back in, I'm going to try to see if I can bring up the slides to do it that way. It could just be, it could be the way the screens are going, so. Thank you, everybody, for your patience. I'm so sorry. Waiting
No
for
problem
her.
at all. Thank you.
Waiting for her to come back in. She went out and she'll come back in a minute. I'm going to try to open up this slideshow and see if I can get it for her. Okay. Miss Lois, while we're waiting, do you want to give a couple updates for our other upcoming events?
Sure. Be glad to. Good afternoon, everyone. Sorry for the technical difficulties, but I'm sure we'll get it straightened out pretty shortly. Well, today, of course, we have Enslaved Life and Labor, and I'm hoping that Lee will be able to get in shortly. But tomorrow we have Freed, Female Reenactors of Distinction. The Female Reenactors of Distinction is a group of ladies who desire to teach American history that perhaps has been forgotten or overlooked. So please join us in promoting the accomplishments of African-American Civil War soldiers and the women who supported their fight for freedom. And if you haven't signed up for that you can sign up and also attend that event. It should be very interesting. They will be 3 reenactors and they will be available for questions after the show. And then on Thursday, February 25th at 7 p.m., we will have one of Greenbelt's historically Black families, or a family, one of the first Black families who moved into Greenbelt. And that is going to be pre-recorded because of the age and some health challenges of the interviewer, Angie Williams. She is being interviewed by Emmett Jordan, so it should be interesting. And while it is going to be pre-recorded, we will be taking questions that will be forwarded to Angie, and she's willing to respond to them. Next Saturday at 3, there will be a belly dance class for those of you that like to get a little bit of exercise. And this class is a beginner's class. And no, you don't need any special equipment for this class. And you will be able to tighten up a few muscles and have fun doing it. And last is, we'll have Sunday the 28th. There will be a musical performance from the Eleanor Roosevelt High School Gospel Choir. And I'm sure you will enjoy that event and just sit down and appreciate the sounds from our young people from Eleanor Roosevelt High School. Rebecca, have you heard from Lee yet?
Well, she's back in. I'm just waiting for her to tell me that she's got it. She's co-host to share her screen, so I'm just waiting.
Okay. Are you able to pull up her sign?
Lee, are you there?
I'm here, but
why don't you just go ahead and continue your talk, and we can provide the slides at a later time?
wait a minute, I'm just. Can you see that?
Yep, go ahead.
All right, you can see the titles page there?
Yep.
right, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to leave it with.
There you go.
Go.
There you go.
All right, I'm going to just use it this way.
Perfect.
All right, but at least we're still back. Okay, so a huge array of tasks was performed at Riversdale. And this is Peggy Calcutt writing about all the things that the plantation mistress had to do. Making cloth, candles, soap, jam, sausages, pickles, clothes for family and servants, draperies and slip covers for the house, in addition to the normal daily food preparation, housekeeping, washing, and ironing. As mistress, all of these tasks fell within Mrs. Calvert's domain. As keeper of the keys to the food supplies, she was on call at all times to measure out what was needed. So you can see that there's really a great deal for her to be doing, as well as for those people who were working there with her. Somebody did this honored work. They were enslaved workers, hired workers, and indentured servants. All right. Now, enslaved workers, children born to enslaved women were slaves for life. But interestingly enough, importing slaves legally actually ends in 1808, on January 1st of 1808. No new slaves could be brought in, but domestic trade continued. There were many laws that people had to follow, restricting their actions and movements, just so that we could preserve that economic and social structure there. They weren't allowed to read and write in most cases. People were not allowed, the enslaved people were not allowed to assemble in groups. That varied sometimes. Sometimes there was a small number put on it. They could have no more than 5 together, or it might be okay to have a group together as long as there was a white person present. They needed passes in order to travel beyond their plantation. Their status could not change unless they were freed by their master through a manumission. Sometimes slave owners had changes of heart, or for one reason or another had made some sort of arrangements, and they would free some of their slaves, or they purchased their freedom. And indeed, many slaves did have opportunities to earn money, and some were able to save money and purchase freedom for themselves and for their families. They were considered chattel or property by law. As Frederick Douglass explains, we were all ranked together at the valuation. Men and women, old and young, married and single, were ranked with horses, sheep, and swine. There were horses and men, cattle and women, pigs and children, all holding the same rank in the scale of being. The first time I read Mistress of Riversdale, there was a paragraph not too far into the book where Rosalie spoke about selling one of the slaves at Riversdale. Her name was Sarah. But in the very same paragraph, she talks about selling a horse because that horse has gotten too old to be of much use. And I remember reading that, and it struck me as so interesting and sort of telling that both of those sales were mentioned in one paragraph, sort of the same way. Okay. Hired workers, some of them were actually already free, and they might be hired for specific jobs, either long-time jobs or short-time jobs. They tended to be more compliant to keep a job, mostly because they were in a position to be able to be fired if they didn't do the work according to the standards of their master or mistress. They were also affected by economic ups and downs. There was an embargo that began in 1807, for instance, and hogsheads of tobacco were mounting up at docks, and there was no ship to put them on to send them overseas, so there was no money coming in. The War of 1812 would have also been a disruption for them. All right, some enslaved workers were also hired out for specific jobs, long-term or short-term. Often they tended to be more confident and independent. They could travel a bit. I think of one, Miranda, for instance, who was at Hillary's plantation and she was hired out to a house in Georgetown. And she would go back and forth, but she was able to sometimes stop and visit her mother. She had a little more freedom. They could sometimes earn cash for themselves, and probably Harriet Tubman is one example of this. When she was hired out at one point, she was expected to bring in $60 for her owner. Anything beyond that, she could keep. Indentured servants tended to be poor European immigrants who certainly wanted a better life, an opportunity to start over, but that didn't exist where they lived in Europe. So they might make arrangements to work for anywhere from 4 to 10 years as farm laborers or domestic servants. And then in exchange, their passage, room, and board was covered. And at the end of that agreed upon time, they received what they called freedom dues. So they would get several acres of land to get started on, plus a few things to help them get started, like a year's worth of corn or arms or a cow or some new clothes. Where did they live? Housing was not built to last. And the house at the top on the, we have very few actually plantations or slave cabins around. The one in the middle, Soderly, is an actual slave cabin. The one up in the left-hand corner has been built again. It was typical of some that were built sort of like duplexes, so they could build one cabin and then put a chimney in the middle with fireplaces on the bottom opening to each side. You can see the 2 doors and the 2 windows. Often a cabin like this would not have more than 1 window. The Soderly plantation cabin, you can actually go visit it now. It's got a dirt floor, but it's exactly as it was many years ago. The picture on the right is a sketch of Adam Francis Plummer's cabin at Riversdale. And what I particularly like about it is that it's sketched by his grandson, Dr. H.V. Plummer. I think that's Henry Vinton, named after his uncle. These are pictures of what's inside. You can see that there would be stairs leading up to a loft. It certainly doesn't look like a very inviting place to live. And you can see on the floors in 2 of these pictures, here and over here, pallets. This is what they would sleep on, and they might be stuffed with corn cobs or straw, so probably not very, very comfortable. I'm going to slide off a little bit here for a few moments to talk about Adam Francis Plummer and Emily Saunders Plummer. Adam was born in 1819 and brought to Riversdale in 1829 to be the personal slave to Charles Benedict Calvert. Charles Benedict Calvert is the founder of the Maryland College of Agriculture, which became the University of Maryland. He's also the head of what eventually became the Department of Agriculture. He did learn to read and write from an itinerant Methodist minister and eventually kept a diary in secret. Emily Saunders Plummer is born around 1815 at Three Sisters in Lanham, and she's owned by Sarah Hillary. Her father was sold shortly after her birth. There was Emily and her brother Benjamin and their mom, and the father was sold to Annapolis and never heard from again. Emily's mom married again and had 23 children with her second husband. Emily's aunt, Lucy, married Will Scott, who worked at Riversdale. And in 1839, she went to visit him. She got sick, and so she stayed there. Now, Emily and and her mother decided to go visit Aunt Lucy. And when they did, Emily met Adam. They were very attracted to each other, apparently. Adam began walking the 8 miles every weekend to see Emily, and eventually they got married, so he was then coming to see Emily and his family. He fixed up her cabin for her and bought her many nice things for it. He made furniture, he put latches on doors and things like that. Adam's diary is now here. There's a picture of the cover of it. It was lost and was rediscovered in 2001, and it is now at the Smithsonian's Anacostia Community Museum. One of the things that's listed in there, and this just kind of shows you some of the extremes, Adam had 3 acres of land, and that's what he was given to be able to grow produce on, and he had quite a business, I gather, on the side of selling produce. He was allowed to use the Calvert's plow to come and work his land. He bought many, many things clearly for his wife and family. And it's kind of, this is just part of the list, but it's a fascinating list of things that are there. She's got wine glasses and a clock. He was a furniture maker, so he probably made some of these trundle beds and bedsteads and things that were found there. Could be found in Emily's cottage. As for clothing, it was given out regularly to the enslaved population, usually once a year or so, and how much varied from plantation to plantation. Children, all children pretty much got a dress, whether they were boy or girl. Men then were given perhaps 2 pairs of pants, 2 shirts, a jacket, a blanket. Women would have been given a couple of dresses. I mentioned Henry Chandley Foreman before about the Turner family in Hebron, and he has a wonderful discussion of the enslaved families there being given their gifts of clothing, actually, at Christmas, and being very excited about that. Rosalie at Riversdale was very, very proud of the clothes that they made. Not only did they make them, but they also made the cloth that a lot of the clothes were made from. As for food, it was distributed regularly, and it depends on which plantation you're on as to what that meant. In some cases, there are descriptions of food being given out weekly. In other cases, in this one in particular, I think where Josiah Henson was enslaved, which is actually near here, excuse me, as well, food was given out once a month. There was an allowance of food, which Henson describes as the principal food of those upon my master's plantation consisted of cornmeal and salt herrings, to which was added in summer a little buttermilk and the few vegetables which each might raise for himself and his family on the little piece of ground which was assigned to him for the purpose, called a truck patch. Josiah Henson, another interesting person, and they are opening a museum near here, Josiah Henson Museum and Park in North Bethesda. Henson was born in Charles County, but sold to Isaac Riley, who was not a very nice person. Twice, Henson made arrangements to purchase his freedom, and twice Riley took the money and did not return it. Finally, Henson decided he'd had enough and made his way to Canada. All right. Field hands, in terms of prestige, this would be the lower part, lower than the house slaves. These people worked essentially from sunup to sundown. They did all the planting, the plowing, the hoeing, the reaping, the herding, the milking, any farm chores that there were. One of Emily Saunders Plummer's jobs as a child was to go down and summon them for lunch because they were provided with lunch. Emily, by the way, became a house slave and finally a cook, very important positions which worked to her advantage over time. It's very hard, apparently, to find a good cook. After an escape attempt, however, Emily was demoted to a field hand. One problem that she had was something that she called dew feet, sort of like athlete's foot. And it was so serious in her case that in later years there was talk of removing one foot. But fortunately, that never actually happened. As for work in the house, a lot of it and a real variety. There were many routine household jobs, making and tending fires, helping with dressing and undressing, heating water for baths, cooking, serving, cleanup, cleaning, dusting, tidying up, greeting callers, even making sure that there was ink and blotting paper available in the study. Seasonal work, there might have been sewing, mending clothes, changing out carpets and furniture because they tended to do that by the season, spinning and weaving, making candles, sausage, jams, and the like, the ice house, decanting wine, all those jobs that they had to take care of. Evenings and Sundays would have been their time. How would they spend it? Doing their cooking, probably their gardening, doing their laundry, doing their own sewing. Music was especially important. And they might have done some singing and some dancing. They might have gathered to socialize, to tell stories, and even to take care of some handwork. As for culture, here they could also practice some of their own culture. Colin Plummer says, Blacks created a culture not because they were slaves, but because that was a function of being human, even if they lived in a hostile environment. They gathered often to dance, sing, socialize. They made instruments. They particularly used gourds. They might make sort of like maracas or drums. They found ways to make or acquire banjos, fiddles. Music was really important. It was a way to sort of continue African traditions, to make work more bearable, to express some of their religious faith, and also to express feelings of joy, sorrow, hope. They also gathered for religious reasons. In some places, they would have large gatherings, often in the woods at night, and supposedly the song "Steal Away to Jesus" could often serve as a code, we're gathering tonight sort of message. They also tended to use wash tubs, and I found several different ways that they used them. One would be to just use it as it sits in this picture, but they would put water in it with the belief that it would absorb their voice and catch it so that white people couldn't hear it. Another thing was to turn it upside down and believing that the sound would go under and be trapped. And sometimes people even got down on their knees in order to pray or sing, hoping that this noise would go underneath the wash bucket. This last picture shows a wedding. Enslaved people were not allowed to enter into legal contracts. And so that meant that they were technically not supposed to go and get married with a marriage license, but they would jump the broom, which was supposed to be a matter of sweeping out the old and sweeping in the new. Okay. Was there resistance? Indeed, there was. Day-to-day resistance, more extreme resistance in terms of running away. Whenever I look at this picture, it's kind of an archetypal picture of a couple escaping with two young children. I always think of Adam and Emily. In 1845, Adam and Emily planned to escape. This would have been extraordinarily risky because they had two small children. Henry Vinton was under 1. Miranda was maybe close to 3 at the time. And it would be really difficult because you'd have to travel and children would have to be quiet at times. In fact, one of the things they did was acquire, if they could, people would acquire Paragora so that they could essentially drug children to get them to be quiet. Now, Emily and Adam had managed to get married in a church, and they had a marriage license, and that is what they planned to use as free papers when they went north. Adam had told Emily not to tell anyone, but she confided to an aunt what they had planned. The aunt went and told Emily's owner, Sarah Hillary, and when Adam and Emily went to get the marriage license, it was gone. Adam was never punished, and we have no idea why, but at least we have no record of any punishment. Emily was. Emily became a field hand and eventually was put up for sale. All right, I'm going to switch back a little bit here. Day-to-day resistance. Dissemblance was probably the biggest form because they did it all the time. And that would be a matter of simply giving a false or misleading appearance to conceal the truth or real nature of how they felt about something. So they would just pretend this is fine, I like it, there's no problem, when really they didn't feel that way at all. I couldn't resist putting in just a little chunk of a poem by Maya Angelou called The Mask. She took a poem by Paul Laurence Dunbar, a short one that's on this same topic, and elaborated on it. And Angelou says, "We wear the mask that grins and lies. It shades our cheeks and hides our eyes. This debt we pay to human guile with torn and bleeding hearts. We smile and mouth the myriad subtleties. Why should the world think otherwise in counting all our tears and sighs? Nay, let them only see us while we wear the mask." Other ways of resistance: do the work badly, sloppily, hide, leave a job unfinished, pretend to be sick, spit in the soup and who would know the difference, balk at doing work, hit back. Actually, Emily did this once. Colonel Thompson, who was her final master when she was in Howard County, was angry with her for what he called insubordination. He had hit her youngest daughter, or her daughter, with a belt strap, and there was a cut on Julia's head from that, and Emily was angry and said so. So Colonel Thompson decided to hit her with his cane. She was in the kitchen, she was a cook, plucking a goose, and she was so angry she picked up the goose and hit him with the goose. And she then went and hid in her room. He sent for the constable to come and punish her. Constable came back with ropes and so on. And Emily confronted them with a chair, almost as if she were trying to tame wild animals, and they backed off. Other times, enslaved people might steal livestock or produce, possessions, food, liquor, anything that wasn't under lock and key, which is really why the plantation mistress carried keys with her all the time and had to go and dispense many, many products of sugar, things like that. Many of the enslaved people viewed the master's property as an extension of him. Committing crimes against property, damaging fences, boats, wagons would essentially, in their minds, be doing the same thing to their owner. Breaking or sabotaging equipment, ruining clothing, setting fire to outbuildings, stables, barns would have been the same thing. Sometimes they even mistreated livestock. I remember reading a description of several men who were enslaved mistreating a group of pigs. And they had nothing against the pigs, but the pigs to them represented the owner. People would sometimes run away. Often they left on holidays or days off to gain lead time before being missed. If you had to work all day Saturday, which they did, and you could take off Saturday evening, that gave you 2 nights in a day to get farther away. They found ways to throw off dogs, like disguising scent with pepper. And many of them used the resources of the Underground Railroad, a network of people offering shelter and aid to escaped enslaved people. The picture there is the one that was finished, I think, about 2 years ago. It's on the side of the Harriet Tubman Museum, the one that's downtown in Cambridge, not the National Park Service one. But Michael Rosato lives right down the street and painted this, and it's beautiful. Sometimes there was extreme resistance and extreme challenge to white authority. Gabriel Prosser in 1800 planned an insurrection. He wanted to create an independent Black state in Virginia. And so he mobilized many, many people, I think something like 1,000 enslaved people. And they were going to march on Richmond and do what damage they could. Unfortunately, bad weather washed out bridges and roads and ruined their plans. So they ended up being arrested and paying the price. Denmark Vesey is another one. He planned a slave revolt in Charleston and was arrested before it could even take place. The only one that I know of that was really fairly successful and effective was Nat Turner's insurrection in August 1831. But of course they caught him and others involved. And sadly that led to many new oppressive laws banning education and movement and assemblies. Punishments would have been meted out not only to punish, but also to serve as warnings to others. Oftentimes they were physical, whether it's a whipping, a beating, mutilation, branding, shackling, and I put a couple of pictures of shackles there, or even imprisonment. It might be a matter of changing jobs, essentially a demotion, which is what happened with Emily, for instance. So she ended up as a field hand instead of having the more prestigious position of working in the house. Other times they would simply sell people. It was easy to get rid of troublemakers by selling them. Sales brought on all kinds of things too, and I put a couple of examples here for you. This one that says $60 reward is actually an ad for Emily Plummer's youngest brother, Robert. He ran away and he got to Canada, very successful. But when Adam used to visit Emily at Three Sisters, he had taught Robert how to read and write. And so one of the things Robert did was write home. And he sent a letter to his mother explaining that he was very happy and hoping that they'd all be together before too long. Well, the letter fell into the wrong hands at Three Sisters Plantation, and the master there, the masters, because there were several farms, began selling off all the family members they could, including Robert's mother. Emily, I mentioned that they wanted to sell Emily when she tried to run away as punishment. She was actually slated to be sold at least once, but she had just had a baby and so she wasn't very well. And they sold her sister Henrietta instead. And in fact, Henny was bought by someone at Marietta. So that's where she was sold to. In 1851, Sarah Hillary died and her nephew inherited her property, and he decided to sell off a good bit of it, including Emily and her children. Adam and Emily made arrangements, and it was apparently sometimes possible to make arrangements to have a family sold intact, and that's what they tried to do. Colonel Livingston Thompson and his wife, the arrangements were made. They were all going to be sold together there. But on the day of the sale, they had a cruel, as he's described, master come to the sale, and he took an interest in Emily's daughter, Julia. Said she would make a fine slave girl for his wife. Emily objected loudly, angering her new master, who decided to split up the family. And sadly, that is what happened. The oldest daughter, Miranda, was hired out instead of moving with her mother. And 5-year-old Elias was kept at Three Sisters. I think when we talk about the trauma of slavery, I often think of Elias. He was allowed to see his mother twice in 10 years for fear that he would want to leave with her if he saw her. Adam occasionally heard reports of their son, Elias, and wrote to Emily telling her that Elias was unkempt. He was kind of dirty, didn't seem to be well taken care of. Elias escaped in 1862 when emancipation was declared in DC. We know he was somewhere throughout the Civil War, and we don't know where. But sometime afterwards, he returned and sort of got back together with the family for a while, but he seemed to come in and out. He went to school, he became a minister and a teacher, but ended up really estranged from the family. And I've often wondered if some of the trauma from having been left as a child and having been the only one who was left as a child isn't responsible for some of what happened to him. Now I want to just have one last slide here about Sarah. This is the Sarah who was sold about the same time as the old mare was sold. The old witch Sarah and her, oops, I can't even read this, were sold for $100. We tried to sell her in Baltimore, but couldn't. She was afraid of being sold to some Georgian, and of course being sold south was worse, and took it in her head to make herself look bad. Finally, she made so many fine promises that she persuaded Ben Lowndes to buy her. Now, the Lowndes family was a big, well-established, long-time established family in Bladensburg, and every time I read this, I wonder what the Lowndes family thought, because George Henry, George and Rosalie's oldest son, wrote in a memoir that the Lowndes family was their nearest and dearest friends. So it'd be kind of interesting. There are a number of books that recount first-person sort of stories about both plantation mistresses and people who were enslaved that are fascinating to read. Mistress of Riversdale with all her letters is certainly one. Josiah Henson, and you probably are familiar with the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave too. If you're not familiar with it, you might want to read Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. Harriet Jacobs was in Edenton, North Carolina, enslaved, and her owner would try and persuade her to come and sleep with him, and she did not wish to. She asserted her independence by getting together with a lawyer in town and having 2 children by him, but her owner persisted, and eventually she spent 7 years living in the crawl space of her grandmother, who was a free Black, her grandmother's house in the town, before escaping to the north. One of the interesting things about her story is at one point she becomes a governess in New York, and the family takes her to England, and she sees peasants who have pretty poor housing there. But she looks at it and she said, you know, this housing is worse than what I knew as an enslaved woman, but I'd take it. It has to be better to be free. The Secret Eye is a Georgia plantation mistress who kept a journal from when she was a young girl. beyond, and actually goes beyond the Civil War, but it's very interesting to read and to see her attitudes change towards the enslaved people. Okay. Any questions?
All right, thanks, Dr. Ryan. What I'm going to do is if you can stop your share, I'm going to start your video again. And if you're able to, we do have a question right now in the chat box. The question to you is, can you talk a bit more about Henry, or Henny, it says, Henry, I think is what they meant. What records were you able to use to find out that he was sold to Marietta, and in what year?
No, actually it is Henny.
I know, I read it wrong, I'm sorry.
The exact year I would have to go and check, and I don't know what this information actually comes. One of the other resources that we have is a memoir published in 1927 by Adam and Emily's youngest daughter, Nellie. And it's kind of an interesting book. When she writes it, she says, I may be too old to be doing this. And in some cases, it's a little hard to follow. And of course, she's born in 1860. And so all of the tales really that she has to tell about being enslaved are secondhand, but it's what she's told and what she learns from her parents and her brothers and sisters growing up. But this is where she learns that Henrietta was sold to Marietta. But that would have been probably 1848, something like that.
Okay, thanks. We do have another question. Do you have a copy of Nellie Arnold Plummer's book? Is it at Riversdale?
I do have a copy of her book, but it's out of print and very difficult to find. Although, one of the things I'm going to do at the end of this is give Becky a list of resources for people. And it is possible to find Nellie's book online. It's with Hathi Trust, and you can get a copy. And the wonderful part of it is that online, the book is searchable. It's not, there's no index if you have a copy of the original book. One of the interesting things about that is that when Nellie wrote that, she mortgaged her house in Hyattsville for $1,000 to have copies printed. And she sent copies to every single relative that she could think of. And where she wasn't sure, but knew that they lived in a town, for instance, she might send it to the, to the postmaster and ask that he distribute it, which he would do. And even in recent years, there have been families that have come together. I can think of one in particular, just kind of visitors from Kansas City, because that's where Henry Denton Plummer had gone after he was dishonorably discharged. And so there are still Plummer family descendants out there. But discovering that they each had copies of what the family calls the book. So.
Okay. The next question we have is, what is it about Emily Saunders Plummer that inspired you to nominate her for the Maryland Women's Hall of Fame?
I love her spirit. I love that even though, she's enslaved, but she speaks up, probably at times when she shouldn't. But she is so devoted to her family, to her children, to her faith, and she just goes through so much. She and Adam have 9 children, 8 live to adulthood. She loses one. I think the youngest, the one who dies, is about a year when that happens. But she just goes through so much pain and suffering because of her family. Her oldest daughter is finally sold to Louisiana, and when the war ends, the family's back together except for Miranda. And Henry is sent down there to bring her back, and he does, and then they're all together. But what she deals with as her children run away. Henry runs away. Elias runs away. She's separated from Elias. There's just so much to admire about what she dealt with and how she handled it.
Okay, thank you. We do have a participant, Dory, has their hand raised and would like to ask a question.
Yes, hi, thank you for the presentation. I have a comment also followed by a question. From the mid-70s to 1980, I lived in a cottage on Cremona Farm in St. Mary's County, Maryland, one of the maybe 8 or so outbuildings. And of course, I imagine in the old days, tobacco was raised there, not of course when I was there. But I wondered, if my little cottage was ever a slave building, and if you know anything about, the early history of Cremona Farm.
I don't. I'm sorry.
Oh, well, look it up. It's a beautiful estate. Now, I understand the owner, my former landlord, died about 10 years ago. But yes, okay, I was just wondering, they must have had slaves.
Well, I'm sure they probably did. Of course, St. Mary's City is where the Ark and the Dove landed.
Right.
Where, when we, that was Maryland's first capital.
Yes, yes, I lived there for 10 years, but at Cremona for 5 years. Beautiful location on the Patuxent River.
Wow.
I've never been able to, well, I haven't delved that deeply, but never been able to find out if it was a plantation of sorts, but whether it was a plantation with slaves or indentured servants. I guess I could find out through Maryland history somehow.
Actually, you should contact the people. Well, there's a museum there and a plantation house.
Yes, I know it well. And actually, the students at St. Mary's College are doing archaeological work there now.
Yes, they are.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you so much.
Great question, thank you. We have one more question. We have a couple more questions, and then I see someone else with their hand raised, so we'll get to them in 1 second. The next question to you, Dr. Ryan, is can you tell us about the free Black population? Annapolis had a big free Black population. How about our area?
Annapolis did, Baltimore did too. Yes, there were some, but I don't know a lot about the free population in this immediate area. But yes, I do know that there were some.
Okay.
And some people, well, Bladensburg, this whole area would have had some, definitely. I can think of some that were originally enslaved and then were manumitted, but stayed in the area. That's what happened with the Bowsers. John Bowser is the Methodist minister who taught Adam Francis Plummer how to read and write. And when he was manumitted, it was along with several brothers and sisters.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from Miss Meredith. If you can unmute and ask your question.
Oh, hello, thank you. I took advantage of a opportunity to tour a plantation in Durham, North Carolina, that's now a teaching site. And at the peak of this plantation's slave owning period, they had 900 slaves on the one plantation. It was one of the biggest ones in North Carolina. What are the more apt to be the size of a Maryland plantation?
Well, it ranged. I mean, you might have had even on a small farm, there might have been just a few people who were enslaved there. And then it kind of, I'm going to guess somewhere between 35 and 50. But there were some that were huge. There were White House on the Eastern Shore. The Lloyd family owned 1,000 slaves.
Wow.
Yeah, and huge acreage. That house is still in the family. So it's not even possible to go see it. it's lovely. It's known for its orangery in the back, but and it's also where Frederick Douglass was. Frederick Douglass writes about as a child crawling under the stairs and sleeping. And he writes about how cruel his owner was. But it just, it ranges all over. If you go to some place like Mount Vernon, that was actually 5 farms. And there were hundreds and hundreds of enslaved people there. And then what George Washington could do there was move his slaves around where he had particular crops coming in or being planted. He could just move a group of workers from one farm to another.
Great question. Dr. Ryan, we did have one of our participants mention that regarding the number of enslaved freed Blacks between 1790 and 1860, Maryland's enslaved population fell, so the number of freed Blacks nearly equaled the number of those enslaved. Maryland had the highest number of free Blacks of any state during the period. However, Prince George's County had the largest number of enslaved. He also went on to mention that he had accessed some census records of that time period for a related project, but didn't know the specific one, just knew that those were the numbers.
Thank you.
Okay, the next question we have coming to you is, are you able to speak on the religious practices of the enslaved, both their own African origins and traditional Christian observances?
Not at great length, I will say that, but I can tell you that, I mean, sometimes missionaries were not very happy because they came in thinking that they would convert people easily. And they found that many who were enslaved were trying very hard to hold on to their African roots. So they wanted to continue and really treasure that background, their heritage. It kind of, it depends on the plantation and the people there. I don't know that there's any one way to answer that question. I do know that here I think about Riversdale and a church that was founded when Sarah Miranda was returned from Louisiana. That night she founded a church, and that church is still in existence. That would have been after slavery.
Okay. Do we have any other questions from our audience? I believe, hopefully I did not miss any in our chat feature, and those that, we do have another question. Miss Judy Davidson? Go ahead and unmute. There you go.
In your presentation, when you said that they gave out clothing and they gave out food once a week, once a month, whatever, you don't mention that the quality of each was so poor that certainly the slaves weren't given out the quality of food that they were cooking for the white people. They weren't given out the clothes. From what I've read, the clothes were such coarse fabric that they physically hurt their skin. The food was basically worse than prison fare. It was gruel. I thought, although your presentation was quite interesting, I thought in some ways you glossed over some of the horrors of slavery. And even when you mention their resistance, they were slaves. They were people who were treated as property. They were people who were not considered people. They were treated worse than the animals on the farm because the animals were very valuable to them. They took care of the crops and everything. I don't think that you gave a very comprehensive view of the horrors of it, of the severity of it, and of the injustice of people thinking that they could own another person.
Oh, no, I absolutely agree with what you say. And that was one of the points I was trying to make when I pointed out that Adam and Emily, who had lives that were not absolutely horrible in some ways that others were. And yet, even for them, it was so awful that they simply couldn't stand it. They wanted to leave. They wanted out of here. As for the food, I mean, I think that just getting a little bit of salted herring and some cornmeal is not a very good diet and not very good food.
Not when you're cooking meat and all kinds of delicacies for the white plantation owner and his guests.
And you're not allowed to have any of it. All you get to do is fix it, serve
And
it.
serve
Yes,
it and clean up afterwards.
absolutely. No,
Yeah.
I totally agree with you. And no, the clothing was certainly not good quality by any means. For the most part, it was coarse.
It was coarse and it was hot. And when they were working in the field, they were dropping from the heat and the fact that they had to wear clothing that would have kept them warm in the winter, and they're working in the summer in the heat, in the sun. Have you read the book? Have you read the book Cast?
Not yet.
Yeah, but everybody's told you about it.
Thank you, Miss Judy. Those were great questions. We do have another question for Dr. Ryan. It comes to us and it asks, can you talk about the picture of the quilt you showed and what the signs meant?
Actually, I wasn't even sure if I should include that picture because that's very debatable. There are some who believe that quilts were used as signs of used for communication, particularly on the Underground Railroad, but a lot of that has been debunked. So yeah, I don't know what exactly the signs are in that particular quilt. But the other problem is that it's almost impossible to find slave quilts because they were used. And of course, once they were used, they weren't, they wore out. So we have very, very little to go on in terms of what these quilts actually were. And
yeah, I do know, Dr. Ryan, that in Harrisonburg, Virginia, they actually have a national quilting museum that does display some of those quilts that were used during the Civil War. So if you get a chance, you should definitely check that out. There
are a few, but not many. Gladys Fry at the University of Maryland did work with quilts, and I worked with her a number of years ago. But it was hard to find very many examples of what she talked about even.
Well, thank you. I believe I've gotten all the questions and certainly appreciate a job well done, Dr. Ryan. And I know with the technical difficulties of Zoom, it can be tricky, but you certainly came through. I do want to turn to Ms. Lois. Do you have any final comments? We do have, sorry, I do want to apologize. I do have one more question. They want to know if you're able to provide the slides that we can share with the group when we send out the final email with your other contact information and the books that you had listed as well.
I am putting together a list of books, yes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Ms. Lois, do you have any final comments?
Well, I want to thank Dr. Ryan. Lee, great job. I know you got frustrated with the technical problems you were having, but this was wonderful. It was informative. And I'm sure most of us really appreciated the effort. Thank you so much for sharing with us and giving us your time.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Our committee's still meeting. We still need you.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. And as I mentioned, I will send out a follow-up email. This presentation was recorded, and I will be able to share that link with you once it is downloaded. And again, we thank you for joining us. We do have other events coming up this end of this month. in the chat. I did provide that, but I will also send the link in the email. But thank you all so much for joining us today.
And
you.
Rebecca, thank you for a great job as usual.
Thank you.
Oh,
Yes,
This was
thank
fun.
you.
Thank you.
you.
I just, yeah.
Okay, well, everybody have a great day. Dr. Lee, if you can stay on for 1 minute after everyone else heads out, I just got a couple things to go over with you.
Sure.
Have a good day.
We'll give everybody a few minutes to log out. That was great.
That was great.
Thanks, Lita.
Is everybody gone?
Not yet. We still have more coming. Just 1 second.
You had about 100 people.
Yeah.
Yep.
And we need this education. Thank you very much.
Yes, I'm trying to get make sure everybody else logs out. Sometimes it takes them a minute to see it. So I'll try to get everybody else out. Yeah, I tried logging in to see if I could bring up the screenshot or this presentation as well, but it wouldn't let me in. It kept telling me that I needed a passcode or something to open
What?
it. Yeah. Yeah, it told me I wasn't permitted to open it.
That's weird.
Yeah. But I do want to let you know too, everybody had put comments into the chat just how much they appreciated the presentation, and a lot of them thought it was interesting and how the committee had arranged it. I should probably turn my video on, sorry, that way you can see me. There we go. Lots of great information, and a lot of them asked about the books, so that's why I figured you would probably include that.
I will. There's, it's kind of that last question.